The soldiers of the Japanese 17th Army stepped onto the shores of Guadalcanal carrying a confidence forged from 5 years of victories across Asia. They had smashed British defenses in Malaya with jungle infiltration tactics, shattered the garrison of Singapore in 70 days, and outmaneuvered Chinese forces in the thick vegetation of Guangxi and Hunan. Every lesson they carried into the South Pacific told them the same thing. Western troops collapsed in the jungle. The British had panicked when cut off at night. Chinese formations crumbled under bayonet charges delivered through thick vegetation. Even the Dutch in the East Indies had broken under the shock of sudden night assaults. To the Japanese, jungle warfare was a domain in which their army reigned supreme, and as their reconnaissance team studied the American perimeter around Henderson Field in August 1942, they saw nothing that suggested these Americans would be different. The U.S. Marines were outnumbered. Many were young, green, and untested. The Japanese believed they would react like every opponent before them: hesitation in the dark, poor direction in thick vegetation, panic when flanked, disorganization when struck suddenly by infiltration attacks. The 17th Army officers, from Hakutake down to battalion commanders, predicted a quick collapse. They believed the jungle itself would be their ally. Yet what they found on Guadalcanal was something entirely outside their expectations. Instead of the hesitant defenders they had crushed in Malaya, they faced a force that had spent every waking hour since landing on 7 August digging, wiring, reinforcing, and shaping the ground into a deadly web of interlocking positions. The Marines did not scatter through the jungle in loose files like the British. They did not stretch their line thin or rely on open static bunkers as the garrison of Singapore had. They built a living defensive organism: foxholes linked by communication trenches, machine gun nests placed along overlapping fields of fire, mortars and 37mm guns positioned to sweep the clearings and river mouths, and observation posts hidden in the foliage to detect movement long before contact. Even more shocking to the Japanese was the discipline with which Americans held these positions. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not intimidated by the darkness. They did not abandon their posts when infiltrated. They rotated fire teams at night, kept ammunition stacked, grenades ready, and every machine gun, especially the M1917A1 water-cooled guns, dug deep, cooled, protected, and ready to fire for hours without overheating. To the Japanese, whose own Type 92 machine guns required careful handling to sustain long fire, the American guns' ability to pour interrupted streams of bullets through humid night air was a revelation they were not prepared for. The Marines' perimeter at Lunga Point was not simply a defensive line. It was a set of overlapping kill zones carefully designed to neutralize exactly the kind of tactics the Japanese believed invincible. And beyond the perimeter lay something else the Japanese had never truly faced in jungle campaigns: a supply system that actually worked. The Marines, supported by the U.S. Navy and the beginning of the Cactus Air Force, had bulk ammunition, functioning radios, centralized command coordination, and the ability to respond rapidly to threats wherever they appeared on the line. This was not Malaya. This was not Shanghai. Guadalcanal was a new kind of battlefield, one where the jungle did not belong exclusively to Japanese soldiers. For the first time, the Japanese army was about to face an opponent that not only refused to panic in the dark, but had structured its entire defense around the expectation of night attacks and infiltration. And as the Japanese prepared their first major assault, they had no idea that the tactics that had brought them glory across Asia were about to collide with something far more disciplined, far more coordinated, and far more deadly than any Allied force they had previously encountered. Long before the Japanese launched their first major assault, the Marines had already transformed the Lunga jungle into a defensive machine designed to bleed any attacking force dry. They understood instinctively, partly from pre-war doctrine, partly from sheer survival instinct, that victory on Guadalcanal depended not on mobility, but on the ability to not break. The Marines who had seized Henderson Field on 7 August 1942 had almost no heavy equipment and barely enough ammunition, but what they did have was discipline, entrenching tools, and a few hard-learned lessons from their own instructors. Dig deep, wire everything, and make the terrain kill for you. By late August, the Lunga perimeter had taken shape, an irregular horseshoe of foxholes,
interlocking trenches, and camouflaged firing pits that stretched from the Matanakaw River on the west to the Ilu River on the east. Every squad position connected to another. Every machine gun covered another machine gun's blind spot. It was a concept alien to Japanese planners who expected the Americans to defend in isolated pockets like British troops in Malaya. Instead, the Marines built defense in depth. If a Japanese platoon infiltrated the first line, it would run headlong into a second. If it broke that, a third waited behind. Even the most vulnerable points, river mouths and narrow clearings, were deliberately turned into killing lanes where multiple M1917A1 water-cooled machine guns overlapped their fields of fire. The M1917A1, heavy and outdated by European standards, became the heart of the Guadalcanal defense. Its ability to fire sustained bursts without overheating made it devastating in jungle fighting. When positioned low in a sandbagged pit, with foliage draped over the barrel jacket, it could sweep entire approaches for hours. Japanese officers had no equivalent weapon that could match this endurance. In Malaya, Japanese infantry had exploited gaps in British lines caused by short bursts and barrel cooldown cycles. On Guadalcanal, they found no such weakness. The Marines could fire until the barrels glowed cherry red, and then keep firing because the water jacket prevented catastrophic overheating. In the days leading up to the first Japanese attempt to retake the island, Marines patrolled constantly, not to seize ground, but to map every approach route. They cut lanes for 37mm anti-tank guns and 75mm pack howitzers, placed barbed wire low to the ground where it could not be seen at night, and set booby traps with grenades tied to roots and branches. They also created listening posts, manned by 2 or 3 Marines who lay motionless in the darkness, trained to distinguish human movement from animals by sound alone. When a Japanese column approached, the listening post radioed back or crawled into the trenches, allowing the defenders to prepare long before contact. On 21 August 1942, the Japanese 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Ichiki, tested the system at the Tanaru Ilu River. Ichiki expected to sweep the Marines aside with a frontal charge and shock tactics, as his forces had in China and on the Malay Peninsula. But as his men advanced across the sandbar in the pre-dawn darkness, they walked directly into the overlapping fire of multiple M1917A1s positioned behind log barriers. The Marines had oriented their guns along the natural funnel of the river mouth, creating a perfect enfilade. When the guns opened, they carved through the Japanese ranks in seconds. Marines on the flanks fired M903 rifles, bars, and 60mm mortar rounds, but it was the water-cooled guns that did the real killing. Columns that in Malaya had overrun British units in minutes were shredded so fast that many Marines described the sound not as gunfire, but as a continuous tearing. Ichiki's men, stunned that their first assault failed, attempted to infiltrate the flanks only to find more trenches, more guns, and more Marines who did not run. When the Americans counterattacked at dawn, supported by 75mm pack howitzers firing over open sights, the remnants of the Ichiki detachment were annihilated. Of 916 men, fewer than 130 escaped. The battle was the first time Japanese soldiers realized that the jungle no longer guaranteed advantage. The Americans were not only holding, they were shaping the battlefield in ways the Japanese had never encountered. In the weeks that followed, Marines continued refining their perimeter. They built parapets, deepened foxholes, reinforced bunkers with coconut logs, and aligned guns to create crisscrossing death zones. They memorized likely avenues of approach and rehearsed firing arcs with sticks in the dirt. They learned to fight at night not through equipment, but through discipline, holding fire until the last second, using flares sparingly, and never leaving a hole unless ordered. What shocked the Japanese most was that the Marines' line behaved not like scattered defenders, but like a single organism, flexing, tightening, shifting, and reinforcing itself automatically whenever pressure applied. The Japanese had arrived expecting a panicked, rigid opponent like the forces they had crushed across Southeast Asia. Instead, they found a force that understood the jungle as well as they did, and that had built a defensive system designed to erase every advantage the Imperial Army believed was its birthright. By mid-September 1942, the Japanese High Command was convinced that the defeat of the Ichiki detachment at the Tenaru
was a fluke, an accident caused by poor reconnaissance and premature attack. Their doctrine insisted that Americans, like the British at Jitra or the Chinese at Changsha, would collapse if struck hard at night and from the jungle's depth. The solution, they believed, was simple. Attack from the high ground south of Henderson Field, bypass the coastal defenses, and smash into the airfield's heart with a concentrated bayonet assault. For this task, they turned to General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a veteran of the Malaya campaign whose night infiltration tactics had repeatedly shattered British positions. Kawaguchi expected the same outcome on Guadalcanal. What he did not expect was that the Americans had anticipated his approach long before his men even broke through the jungle canopy. The high ground Kawaguchi selected, Hill 123 and the ridges running east toward the Lunga River, was defended by Marine raiders and parachute Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. Edson's raiders were not typical infantry. They were veterans of Tulagi and Tesimboko, hardened by close-quarter fighting and conditioned to operate in darkness with discipline matching anything the Japanese had shown in Malaya. Their positions along the ridge were deceptively simple: foxholes dug into the red clay, machine guns placed low behind the folding curves of the ridgeline, and mortars hidden in shallow pits. But the true strength of their defense was not the earthworks. It was Edson's uncanny ability to read the terrain and predict exactly how Kawaguchi would attack. On the night of 12 September, as the jungle began to pulse with the sounds of Kawaguchi's 3,000 men closing in, Edson ordered his companies to pull back from the forward spurs and tighten onto the main ridge. It looked like a retreat, but it was an intentional funnel. When the first Japanese elements reached the abandoned lower slopes, they found nothing but silent trees. Believing the Americans were fleeing, they pushed upward in dense columns, bunching exactly where Edson wanted them. Then the Marines opened fire. M1917A1 machine guns poured steady, unbroken streams of bullets across the slope. BARs swept the flanks. Mortarmen dropped shells that arced over the raiders' heads and burst in tight clusters among the climbing Japanese formations. The ridge shook with the impact, but the Japanese pressed forward, screaming, throwing grenades and firing knee mortars. In Malaya or on the Yangtze front, these attacks had shattered Allied morale. Here, they met Marines who had rehearsed this moment every night for weeks. The Japanese broke through the first line, but the raiders did not collapse. Edson's reserve company surged into the gaps, counterattacking with bayonets and shotguns. Flares illuminated the ridge in harsh white light, revealing waves of Japanese troops closing in from the jungle. Yet despite the chaos, American fire was coordinated, deliberate, and disciplined. Every raider knew his sector. Every machine gun crew knew which arcs not to cross. Every mortar team fired by pre-registered coordinates plotted during daylight walks through the ridge's tangled undergrowth. The fight lasted through the night, and again on the night of 13 September, when Kawaguchi launched a massive assault aimed directly at the center of Edson's line. The raiders were pushed back to the final crest overlooking Henderson Field itself. Journalists later wrote that if Kawaguchi had taken that ridge, the entire American presence on Guadalcanal might have collapsed. But the Marines held. They held because Edson shifted his men like pieces on a chessboard, reinforcing wherever the Japanese pressure peaked. They held because the raiders, though exhausted and bleeding, refused to give ground without specific orders. They held because the machine guns, water-cooled and tireless, never stopped firing. And when artillery from the 11th Marines poured 10.5mm shells onto the jungle approaches, Kawaguchi's best units were reduced to disorganized fragments. When dawn finally broke on 14 September, The slopes of Edson's Ridge were carpeted with the bodies of more than 600 Japanese soldiers. Kawaguchi himself, wounded and stunned, retreated into the jungle, later writing that he had never faced an enemy with such resolve and discipline at night. It was not that the Americans were better jungle fighters than the Japanese, it was that their entire structure, from fire discipline to artillery coordination, turned Japanese strengths into weaknesses. For decades, Japanese doctrine had relied on the psychological shock of night assaults, but on Guadalcanal, these attacks collapsed against a defender who refused to fear the dark, who refused to fire blindly, and who had engineered the terrain so that every Japanese approach, no matter how stealthy, ended inside a kill zone. Kawaguchi's defeat was more than a tactical failure. It was the moment the Japanese army realized the Americans were not Singapore's garrison, not the Chinese nationalists, not the outmatched Dutch. This was a new opponent, one who understood the jungle in a way that the Japanese had believed impossible. And the myth of Japanese night supremacy shattered on that ridge.
In every campaign the Japanese army had fought since 1937, their jungle warfare doctrine relied on a simple assumption. Once they closed with the enemy, during a night assault, a flank infiltration, or a sudden bayonet charge, the defenders would break before fire support could intervene. In China, British Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, this formula had worked because Allied artillery was slow, poorly coordinated, or completely absent. But on Guadalcanal, the Japanese encountered something they had never faced: American artillery that could respond within minutes, land rounds with frightening accuracy in the densest jungle, and fire in coordination with aircraft based only a few thousand yards away at Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force, a ragtag but lethal mix of Marine SPDs, F-4F Wildcats, P-400s, and Navy TBFs, changed the nature of the campaign before most Japanese soldiers even reached the front. Unlike in Malaya or Burma, where the Japanese had enjoyed total air superiority, Guadalcanal forced them to march, fight, and resupply under constant threat from dive bombers. Every daylight movement risked detection. Barge convoys were shredded in Iron Bottom Sound. Even the elite Tokyo Express destroyers could only deliver supplies at night, and even then only in small bundles thrown overboard in drums. The result was simple and devastating. By October, most of the 17th Army was starving. Men who had stormed Singapore on full rations were now trying to assault fortified American positions while surviving on half-rotten rice and rainwater from their helmets. But the real shock came when Japanese soldiers discovered that even in the jungle, their supposed domain, American artillery did not disappear. Forward observers from the 5th Marines and 11th Marines crawled into treetop hides, perched on ridgelines, or hunkered inside camouflaged pits, using the SCR-300 and SCR-536 radios to call in fire missions with a speed and precision unheard of in earlier Pacific battles. They plotted potential attack routes onto hand-drawn maps, pre-registered firing zones, and rehearsed shell patterns that could be triggered within seconds the moment Japanese troops were spotted or heard. During the major Japanese offensive of 23-24 October 1942, sometimes called the Battle for Henderson Field, Major General Masao Maruyama's 7,000-man force attempted a massive night attack along the southern sector of the perimeter. Maruyama expected his infiltration columns to slice through what he believed were thin, loosely held American lines. What he found instead was a defense built like a steel hinge, flexible enough to absorb shock, rigid enough to never break. As the 1st Japanese assault companies approached the Marine positions of the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, they were detected not by sight, but by sound, the faint clatter of equipment, a whispered order, a snapped twig. Forward observers immediately radioed the coordinates. In less than 90 seconds, 105mm howitzers from the 11th Marines were firing concentrations so precise that entire Japanese platoons were erased before reaching the outer wire. Survivors staggered forward only to run into the interlocking machine gun fire of Mi 1917A1s dug deep into the clay. Japanese infantry who had stormed the British lines at Kotobaro and the Chinese lines at Shuzhou now found themselves crawling over ground, blasted into muddy craters. The American artillery did not stop.
It adjusted, shifted, and followed the attackers as if the guns themselves could see in the dark. Mortar crews firing 81mm shells added a second layer of death, dropping bombs into ravines and jungle folds where Japanese soldiers tried to regroup. When the main assault fell on the positions held by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion 7th Marines, the Japanese expected, at last, to break through. Instead, they encountered a wall of fire that seemed to come from every direction. Puller's men held even when Maruyama's troops penetrated the first line. Counterattacks sealed the gaps. Flares illuminated attacking columns like theater spotlights, and artillery zeroed in on the glowing figures. A Japanese survivor later wrote that the American guns were as fast as lightning and as accurate as a surgeon. The next morning revealed the scale of the disaster. More than 1,500 Japanese soldiers lay dead along the southern perimeter. Many had never fired a shot. Their famed night assault tactics, so effective against armies unprepared for sudden darkness, were useless against defenders whose artillery and air support functioned seamlessly even at midnight. And while the Japanese struggled through the jungle with starvation creeping into their ranks, the Americans had the opposite problem. They had more shells than they could fire. Henderson Field, constantly resupplied by transports braving the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, served as an artillery hub, unlike anything the Japanese had ever encountered in a jungle environment. This combination, disciplined defenders, rapid artillery, and local air power, not only broke the Japanese assaults, but destroyed the very foundation of Japanese jungle warfare doctrine. The jungle no longer concealed their approach, darkness no longer guaranteed surprise, infiltration no longer created panic. American artillery had rewritten the rules of the battlefield, and the Japanese 17th Army learned the lesson in blood. What stunned Japanese soldiers most wasn't the firepower itself, but the coordination. Aircraft spotting targets by day, observers marking them by night, and guns firing exactly where they needed to with terrifying speed. For the first time since the beginning of the Pacific War, the Japanese Army realized that their proven formula, the one that had crushed empire after empire, simply no longer worked. Guadalcanal had become a killing ground shaped not by the jungle, but by the Americans who had mastered it in a way no previous opponent ever had.
By November 1942, the Japanese 17th Army was no longer a fighting force in any meaningful sense. It was a starving, disease-ridden mass of exhausted men stumbling through the jungle south of Henderson Field, battered by artillery, mauled by counterattacks, and decimated by the Cactus Air Force every time they tried to move in daylight. The same soldiers who had marched triumphantly into Singapore now crawled through the kunai grass searching for roots and insects to eat. Malaria and dysentery tore through the ranks. Entire companies collapsed from hunger before they even reached the front. Their commanders had promised an easy victory over an untested enemy. Instead, the Japanese found themselves trapped in a grinding war of attrition, precisely the kind of battle their doctrine had never prepared them to fight. The turning point had already come in late October, when Maruyama's massive night assault shattered itself against the American lines. From that moment on, the Japanese were no longer trying to win Guadalcanal, they were trying to survive it. Every attempt to launch another offensive collapsed under the same brutal arithmetic. No food, no ammunition, no replacements, and an opponent whose firepower and discipline grew stronger with each passing week. The Cactus Air Force tightened its chokehold on Japanese supply routes. Barge convoys were annihilated. Tokyo Express destroyers could deliver troops, but almost no supplies. Japanese soldiers received rations so small they joked bitterly that the only thing still plentiful was rainwater. Men who had once carried 50-pound packs now weighed barely 90 pounds. Meanwhile, the Americans improved their perimeter daily. They built new bunkers with coconut logs, extended wire obstacles, and brought up additional artillery. The arrival of U.S. Army regiments in late November provided fresh reserves, freeing the exhausted Marines. The Japanese expected these Army units to be inferior in jungle fighting, but instead found them as disciplined and deadly as the Marines. Further proof that Guadalcanal had forged a new kind of American soldier. In December, the Japanese tried again with small unit infiltrations along Mount Austin and the Gifu strongpoint. The terrain was nightmarish, knife-edged ridges, tangled vegetation, cliffs.
but the Americans treated it as a tactical puzzle rather than an insurmountable obstacle. Infantry companies advanced methodically with mortars, flamethrowers, and artillery spotting teams. The Japanese defended fiercely, but their positions were isolated, undersupplied, and constantly harassed by American patrols and aircraft. For the first time in the Pacific War, it was Japan whose troops were being cut off, surrounded, and destroyed piecemeal in the jungle. By January 1943, the situation had become impossible to conceal from Tokyo. The Imperial General Headquarters finally faced reality. The 17th Army could not hold Guadalcanal. The decision was made, quietly, almost shamefully, to withdraw. The Japanese called it Operation K, a euphemism meant to disguise a retreat as a reinforcement operation. Between 1 and 7th of February 1943, destroyers extracted roughly 11,000 survivors from Cape Esperance. They left behind thousands of dead comrades whose bodies had already been swallowed by the jungle or burned during the battles. For the Japanese who escaped, the shock was personal and ideological. Guadalcanal exposed a truth they had never believed possible. Their jungle warfare superiority was not inherent, not mystical, and not unstoppable. It had worked against colonial armies, poorly supplied defenders, and troops unprepared for night combat, but against Americans who dug deep, coordinated firepower, and used the terrain as aggressively as they did, the Japanese formula simply shattered. The myth of the invincible Japanese night assault died on the slopes of Edson's Ridge. The myth of Japanese infiltration supremacy died at the Tanaru. The myth of jungle dominance died under the arcs of M1917A1 machine guns and the precision of U.S. artillery. The American victory on Guadalcanal wasn't just a tactical achievement, it was a psychological earthquake. Japanese soldiers who had survived the retreat later wrote in diaries that the Americans were unyielding, disciplined, and fearless at night, descriptions previously reserved for their own troops. One officer lamented, "In Malaya, the jungle favored us. On Guadalcanal, the jungle belonged to the enemy." Guadalcanal rewrote the balance of the Pacific War. The Japanese army never again launched a major offensive in the South Pacific. Their aura of jungle invincibility was gone forever. Meanwhile, the United States gained confidence that its infantry, Marines, and Army alike could meet and defeat Japan in the very environment the Imperial Army considered sacred ground. But the deeper legacy lay in the transformation of American doctrine. Guadalcanal proved that U.S. forces could build defensive networks under extreme hardship, coordinate combined arms in dense terrain, and fight night battles with a level of discipline that shocked the Japanese. The lessons learned on the island shaped every subsequent campaign: Cape Gloucester, Bougainville, Peleliu, Okinawa. The Japanese arrived on Guadalcanal expecting another Singapore, a swift victory earned by jungle infiltration and the psychological shock of night attack. What they found instead was Henderson Field, dug-in Marines, relentless artillery, and an enemy that refused to fear the dark. In 6 months of brutal fighting, the myth of Japanese jungle supremacy dissolved, replaced by a new reality. The Americans had mastered the jungle, and the war would never again favor Japan.